Christianity. And the rule of Justinian, who ruled for about 30 years around the middle of the 6th century in Constantinople, which by that point had become the capital of the empire, virtually by default, because the Western Empire had eroded and Rome had been sacked for the last time in 476, which meant that really the power had shifted to the east pretty substantially by that point. This continues a process that began under Constantine, when we talked about a few weeks ago. Constantine became the first Christian emperor in 312. He became emperor, he was sort of a junior emperor of one of the Caesars before that in 306. But basically for 25 years or so, he continues to develop this notion of a Christian emperor, which will be played out under subsequent emperors and finally under the time of Justinian. I think it's fair to say that you have the maturity or the maturation of the notion of Christian emperor, something that took about 200 years to develop. And I'm going to take us through a little bit of that history so we can see how that unfolds before getting into specific accomplishments of Justinian. But here are the key questions that I think we bring to what we're considering this morning. First and foremost, this is a question that, again, gets raised for the first time with Constantine. What is the proper political and religious role of a Christian emperor? This is a brand new phenomenon. Theologians had had no opportunity, really, to think about this question because it seems so absurd. In earlier generations, Diocletian, the emperor who precedes Constantine, was one of the most notorious persecutors of the Christian church. The idea that the script would be flipped just within a span of a decade or so would have been, very, very startling and was very surprising to the church as well as to the Roman administrative structure of the empire. So what does this mean for a Christian emperor? Is he expected to embody a particular standard of Christian policy in his government? Should Christianity be informing the law code of the empire? Or perhaps should a Christian emperor limit his role to the political sphere, be concerned with matters of war and peace, taxation, see civil law in a more secular guise? Or should he also be guiding the Christian church as part of his responsibilities? So those are huge questions that have to be worked through here the first couple hundred years of this arrangement. And then, of course, we have the ongoing question, how does Christianity relate to other faiths? Specifically, in the early 4th century, the question concerned pagan religion and how a Christian emperor would be relating to the traditional religion of Rome, a tradition that had gone on by this point for over 1,000 years. And of course, given that there were a lot of Jews as well in the Roman Empire, that also became a point of some contention in the 4th century and onward. So these are the big questions, and Constantine really didn't have any definitive answers to these questions. They were worked out on a provisional basis during his reign and then the subsequent emperors who followed him. What does seem clear is that Constantine took very, very seriously his responsibility as a Roman emperor, and preserving the empire was always his first and foremost goal. Now, he did believe that the Christian God had offered him assistance in gaining power, and that the Christian God would assist him in maintaining the empire, but maintaining the empire was crucial, and also maintaining continuity with emperors who had preceded him. And we can see this in a number of ways. First and foremost, of course, military conquest is always central for any Roman emperor. In Constantine's case, this involves first going after rivals, because he was not the sole emperor when he took power in 312, and he finally has to defeat his rival Licinius, who dispatches in 325 in the last of those civil wars. So he becomes sole emperor really for the last decade or so, 12 years or so of his life. Once he takes care of his rivals to becoming emperor, then he has to go over and take care of Rome's foreign enemies, which had by this point really, really intractable. He had the Goths to deal with in Europe, and then he had the Persian Empire in the east. The Persian Empire had long been a threat to the Eastern Empire. And in fact, Constantine died in 337, just as he was preparing for a massive effort to try to get vengeance against the Persians. So again, military conquest, a pivotal part of the picture. Now, in terms of in terms of Constantine's attitude toward religion, I think we can see him here as a bit of a pragmatist. He clearly sees himself as beholden to the Christian God, but he's really circumspect when it comes to explaining what that means, in a public capacity at least. He certainly did not go in any major way to abolish pagan worship in traditional temples. He didn't want to enrage the old order, which still had a great deal of power in the empire. Those patricians who had long established themselves in the upper ranks of the elite in Rome, the last thing he wanted to do was make enemies there. So when he promoted Christianity, he chose to promote Christianity alongside traditional Roman religion, rather than as something which would supplant it. So when Constantine creates Constantinople as the new Rome, as he called it, this was to be his project. This was to be his holy city. And there he could build churches to his heart's content without enraging the old order. Now, if he had tried that sort of thing in Rome, he would have gotten in a lot of trouble. So he did promote church building in Rome, but to a much lesser degree than what he was able to do in his new holy city. So that's a good example of how he's not trying to suggest that he's making a radical break with the past, but there is a new supreme deity that he's trying to promote as much as possible. When he took control of matters concerning religion, it was usually when religion was becoming divisive, when there was a civil problem connected to it. So some of the earliest instances where you have laws specifically against Jews in the Roman Empire, and those do start to emerge by the 4th century, and they do start to emerge under Constantine's rule. It's going after the Judaizers who were taking Christians and trying to bring them back into the Jewish fold. This Constantine saw as a civic threat, not just a religious one. And that's emblematic, I think, of where he was inclined to take action in matters of religion. It's where there was a civil problem, not just a religious one. You could even see his leadership at the Council of Nicaea in 325 in the same light. The Arian controversy wasn't just a religious theological question that was pulling the churches apart, it was threatening to pull the empire apart. The divisions were so immense and violence was breaking out that Constantine felt he had to act. Constantine didn't understand the details of the controversy. What he understood was that Christians were killing Christians, and this was a bad sign for the empire, not just for the church, and so he convenes the council to deal with this. Okay.
Hey, Trey?
Yes.
Was this the beginning of anti-Semitic writings, teachings, and thinking, or?
No, I mean, you can see a lot of tensions between Christians and Jews going all the way back to the 1st century. You know, I mean, Jewish communities had a lot of resentment of Christians, really going all the way back to Paul's missionary efforts. You know, they saw Paul as coming in and poaching Jews and claiming them for the new faith, and Christians, you know, again, sometimes the Judaizing movement would be very assertive in trying to tell Christians, look, you know, you're abandoning your faith here, and would try to influence them in a variety of ways. And so there were tensions going back really to the late 1st century. The difference here is that now Christians have political power, and so those controversies now can play out in a political way and not just in a religious way. That's what's changed. But again, you know, even though a lot of people say, well, you know, anti-Semitism in the Christian empire begins with Constantine, generally Constantine lumped Judaizers along with pagans and other kinds of troublesome folk who were trying to create religious disunity. I mean, those were always his foremost concerns. If Jews kept to themselves, if pagans kept to themselves, and you know, understood that there was now a new Christian emperor, but didn't try to make waves, generally he was okay with that. He didn't seek to. In other words, anti-Semitic persecution, I think, would be a strong term to use in describing Constantine. Now, later in the 4th century, by the time we get to the 5th century, there are laws which seem much more invidious in the way that they go after Jews in particular as being a threat. It's not really the case under Constantine, though, so far as we can tell. All right. So yes, when making statements about religion, Constantine generally was very circumspect. He would occasionally refer to the supreme God, but that was not terribly uncommon. Even in the 3rd century, Constantine's father had made occasional reference to a supreme deity. That was not inherently non-Roman to make that kind of thing. Of course, he wouldn't refer specifically to Jesus typically in public. So again, he was He was quite careful about this. And the Arch of Constantine, which is one of the most magnificent architectural monuments to Constantine's greatness. You have Apollo and Hercules depicted there, and all the traditional Roman pantheon are represented. So you don't see Constantine making a radical break with the legacy of Rome in that way. However, it certainly was clear, especially to Constantine's detractors, and he had many. I mean, there were a lot of traditional Romans here who did not celebrate the fact that the emperor had converted to Christianity. They noted, of course, that Constantine's armies marched under the labyrinth, the Cairo symbol, which was there on all of his official insignia, banners, and so forth. When they saw him convene the Council of Nicaea, this clearly suggested that the emperor's tie to Christianity was the most important now in his religious vision. And they also, of course, witnessed the church building in various ways in which Constantine was directly supporting the new faith, and of course doing so with taxpayer money. So there was a new regime, no question, and this begins what eventually becomes Caesaropapism, and the idea that that Caesar can now be a guiding force in the church, something that, of course, to traditional Romans was seen as a big source of worry. Okay, now we have a number of figures after Constantine's death who we can see as furthering this process, starting with Emperor Theodosius, a very important figure who rules from 379 to 395. Theodosius is important for a number of reasons. He convened the Council of Constantinople in 381. This is where we have our current version, more or less, of the Nicene Creed, including an addition on the Holy Spirit, which was not present at the Council of Nicaea in 325. Theodosius was emphatic that Nicene Christianity would be the official religion of the Roman Empire. Priests that could not abide by it were no longer to serve in their offices. So this reflects certainly, I think, a degree of maturation with respect to the emperor's insistence on not just Christianity, which he does make the official religion of the empire, but Nicene Christianity in an attempt to dispel some of those controversies that were still lingering, really, from the Arian period. And Theodosius, unlike Constantine, went up against pagan festivals. He closed a lot of the temples, and it famously canceled all the Olympic Games, starting in 393 because of their lingering ties to pagan religious festivals of various kinds. Also, we see Theodosius decreeing that Constantinople would now be, quote, second to Rome in overall authority within the church. This is also a brash move, and it suggests not only that Theodosius is getting more active, or that the emperor is getting more active in religious affairs, but that there's been a power move as part of this, right? The old Rome is still important, yes, perhaps in a symbolic effect more than anything else, but now Constantinople is elevating itself in status, and that becomes important for a lingering east-west rivalry that I'll say more about in a little bit. Okay, so that's Theodosius. Then we have Theodosius II, who rules from 408 to 450. And Theodosius II is dealing with the Nestorian controversy, which we talked about a few weeks ago. That's still alive and well, so he's convening ecumenical councils to deal with that. He's also got military concerns, of course, with the Huns, who are now on the rise, and the Persians, who remain a threat. And then in the west, the Vandals, among other Germanic tribes, have been very active in North Africa, so he's trying to solidify the empire from its various enemies. And then he produces the Codex Theodosianus in 438 to try to go back to the time of Constantine and essentially gather and compile and distill the essence of all those edicts and decrees and various policies that had emerged over that 150 years or so. Then we get to Marcion, who follows him, convenes the Council of Chalcedon, which we had talked about. That concerned the Nestorian controversy. That's not going to go away, but it's an attempt that Marcion makes to try to solve that issue. And again, recurring theme here, going after the Huns, trying to secure Constantinople and make sure that it would not fall. And his intentions to Constantinople are pretty significant here and suggest that by this point, certainly by the mid-5th century, the West is really, really withering. Military attacks have become much more difficult for Western emperors to get a handle on, and so the power shift by this point is really complete. The East is where it's at, and Constantinople is going to be the jewel of the empire, whereas Rome is eventually going to fall for the last time really in 476, just a couple decades from now. So you can see in the rule of Marcian an attempt to preserve the East as being really the carrier of Christianity. Very importantly also, under Marcian, you have not only the reinforcement of Constantinople as being the jewel of the empire, but you have the patriarch of Constantinople, who is elevated in standing here. Prior to this point, you really didn't, the notion of patriarch was really one that comes about in the 5th century. Prior to this, you had archbishops, you had bishops of particular cities that turned out, of course, to be more important based on the city's prestige. So the Bishop of Rome, of course, always important. Doesn't really start being referred to as the Pope until around maybe the late 4th century, early 5th century. The Pope, I should say the Bishop of Constantinople, clearly very important. The Bishop of Caesarea, important. The Bishop of Alexandria. So you had, a handful of cities or so where those bishops would be particularly important and powerful. But now the idea of the patriarch is to take it up another level altogether. And with the idea of the patriarch of Constantinople, you now have a rival to the Pope in Rome. And that West-East rivalry is just going to play out much more fully in the next several centuries. But I put this in bold here because you don't want to ignore this fact. The fact that the Patriarch of Constantinople is appointed by the emperor is pretty critical. It really is. Because it suggests that unlike the West, where the Pope was not chosen by the Western emperor, there's a different relationship between church and state in the East. And that, I don't know if Marcian was fully aware of what he was unleashing on the church by doing this, but that's pretty much how it played out. And subsequent emperors, of course, would enjoy the liberties of being able to appoint the patriarch. And it does suggest that there's a radical change that has happened here within just 100 years or so of Constantine. Okay, so now we get to Justinian. All right, Justinian rules from 527 to 565, and here I think it is fair to see the maturation of imperial Christianity really in full flower. So first off, and of course we have to start here, we have the military conquests under his fabled general Belisarius. Justinian was a little different than his predecessors in that he didn't insist on being in the field of battle. It was always considered an honor for Roman emperors to engage directly in whatever wars they were declaring, but Justinian chose not to do that. Instead, he had a genius of a general, Belisarius, who did a great deal to regain a lot of the lands that had been lost in the West to the Ostrogoths, who had been a threat to Rome, the city of Rome in particular, in Italy. He wins back a lot of North Africa from the Vandals and has more successes than his predecessors in dealing with the Persians. And by this point, really, the Persian Empire was already starting a decline. So part of that is the reason for his victories there. And once Islam rises, they're going to wipe out the Persians in short order. So that's coming. It's about another century from now. In terms of the grandeur of Constantinople, Justinian dedicated himself in earnest to making sure that after there had been some riots prior to his reign, he wanted to make sure that Constantinople was restored to its former glory and even surpassed it. So you had a brand new imperial palace complex. The Hippodrome was built, sort of the eastern version of the Roman Colosseum, where chariot races were particularly popular, sort of the 6th century version of NASCAR. Very popular. A whole bunch of public works projects to win over the poorer residents of Constantinople. So Justinian's seen as a benefactor to the people, no question. Church building has to be noted here. The Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom, the most famous example, but lots and lots and lots of church building. Justinian sees that as his responsibility. And then in terms of the law, you have Justinian's Code of Civil Law, really, really important for a number of reasons. First and foremost, it establishes a continuity going all the way back to Emperor Hadrian in the 2nd centuries to show really that this is still Rome. And even though a lot of historians start referring to the 6th century Eastern Empire as Byzantium, or as the Byzantine Empire, Justinian was adamant that he was a Roman emperor. And so to try to show the long, centuries-long legacy tying all the way back to the 2nd century was very important, just as a way of selling the significance of the civil law. Since it was written in Latin, this is also important. The Eastern Empire, of course, Greek was the predominant language, but they wrote the civil law in Latin, knowing that it could then serve as a basis not just in the East, but also in the West. It turns out to be more important down the road, especially after Charlemagne is crowned Holy Roman Emperor, because Justinian's civil law can then be used as a basis for subsequent law codes that will be formulated starting in the 9th century in the West. And it's written in Latin, and that's what allows that to happen more easily. Okay, and then in terms of the theocracy, really, that we see unfolding here under Justinian. Part of it's, again, just the fact that the West was withering. And given that the West was withering and the city of Rome itself was now under Germanic control, there wasn't really a whole lot that the Pope in the West was prepared to do to challenge the emperor and his patriarch. That's just a reflection of politics, really. But you can also see Justinian being very explicit now in blurring those lines between religion and government more than ever before. So in Justinian's law code, even though you don't have a whole lot that has to do specifically with Christianity, you don't see a lot of Christian influence in specific details, he was adamant that the law code needed to be posted in all the churches, as Wilkin puts it, so people could see that it was consecrated to God and enacted for the benefit of the men created by him. He wanted people to see that the laws had been ordained by God and that this was part of their Christian observance. Starting a precedent that you can now see in the United States when witnesses are sworn in. All trials, judicial hearings required an oath to be taken while laying in hand a book on the Gospels, basically. So you can see ways in which Christianity is undergirding the political order and the law code that Justinian had provided. Famously, in 529, he made a decree that all philosophical schools in Athens be closed, which is interesting for a number of reasons. I mean, we're talking about the Eastern Empire here. We're talking about a civilization that is fueled by Greek wisdom. People going all the way back to Plato and even before, and seeing this as the carrier of intellectual advancement, and yet here's Justinian trying to put an end to it. Now, it really wasn't carried out with much earnestness on the part of imperial administrators, but it was symbolic in saying that now we want our philosophers to focus on the cross rather than the pagan wisdom of the past. So it was an interesting move, and certainly reflects the way in which the rules have been changed now, and Christianity's attitude toward the pagan past of Greek civilization. In 551, he issues the True Faith Edict, which is still, again, trying to work with the problems created by the Council of Chalcedon. Egyptian and Syriac-speaking churches in particular were less inclined to accept the Chalcedonian logic, and Justinian was doing his best to anathematize them, those anti-Chalcedonian bishops who continued to resist his authority. And then we've got a couple of texts, and I think what the texts help us to see is the way in which you have a shift that's happened really over the last, by this point, 200 years or so, starting with Constantine, and now this is the maturation of what the Byzantine emperor or the Eastern emperor is prepared to do with respect to matters of religion. And you can see this, text number 1, which is from Justinian's civil law. This is one of those instances where the emperor is prepared to speak directly to the question of Christianity and the emperor's role in maintaining it. And this was written to Epiphanius, archbishop, and the patriarch of Constantinople. He says, "The priesthood and the empire are the two greatest gifts which God in his infinite clemency has bestowed upon mortals. The former has reference to divine matters, the latter presides over and directs human affairs, and both, proceeding from the same principle, adorn the life of mankind. Hence, nothing should be such a source of care to the emperors as the honor of the priests who constantly pray to God for their salvation. For if the priesthood is everywhere free from blame, and the empire full of confidence in God is administered equitably and judiciously, general good will result, and whatever is beneficial will be bestowed upon the human race. Therefore, we have the greatest solicitude for the observance of the divine rules and the preservation of the honor of the priesthood, which, if they are maintained, will result in the greatest advantages that can be conferred upon us by God, as well as in the confirmation of those which we already enjoy, and whatever we have not yet obtained, we shall hereafter acquire. For all things terminate happily where the beginning is proper and agreeable to God. We think that this will take place at the sacred rules of the church, which the just, praiseworthy, and adorable apostles, the inspectors and ministers of the word of God, and the holy fathers have explained and preserved for us, are obeyed. That is, the emperor has a responsibility to adhere to making sure that the church is in good hands, which includes not just the patriarch and bishops, but priests as well. Yes.
I want to be an adorable apostle.
Yeah, that's an interesting phrase, isn't it?
I'm struck by this because it sounds to me sort of like old Roman Empire thought, which I understand it to be that you sacrifice to the pagan gods and the Roman Empire will flourish, right?
Yeah.
So we just replaced the pagan gods with the God, the Father, Jesus Christ, but it's the same idea. If you take care of the priests, who then are the ones who administer the sacraments, then Rome will flourish.
Well, it seems that way. It seems that way. I think what's going to be a headache, though, it's certainly a headache for Justinian in some instances, and it's going to be a headache for the emperors that follow him, is that the Christian church had a separate institutional logic and had separate traditions which had already evolved independently of the Roman state, right? The Roman civic cult never had a separate existence other than the Roman Republic or eventually the Roman Empire. So there really was nowhere to stand. If you were a priest in the traditional Roman system, you answered to the emperor. There was no, what else were you going to do? That's why you were there. It was a purely civic function, really. The Romans didn't worry about the afterlife. The Roman gods were there to provide prosperity for Rome. And as the emperor, as the god's regent, would then be responsible for everything that the cult is doing, right? With Christianity, it's sort of like you're trying to bring the church within that fold, and that's not going to be a simple process because, for one reason, not all the bishops are thrilled about this. This is a serious shift in the way that and who they're supposed to answer to and how they're supposed to understand their ultimate responsibilities to the civic order. And most of them are playing along because they understand how much power is now concentrated in Constantinople in the emperor's decrees. And it helps that Justinian is an enormously popular and in a lot of ways beneficent ruler, right? So how are they going to go up against it? But in some ways, I think you see the mind of a traditional emperor at work here, but he's dealing with an institution that's going to be a lot harder to wrangle, maybe, than he thinks. That's certainly going to be here, yeah.
There's lots of things that could be said to mitigate some of the issues that you're raising. I mean, not to take. I agree with what you're saying, and that it is a challenge. But one of the things that happens when this shift occurs is that the ultimate source of authority goes beyond the emperor to God. And so God is actually the source of both the priesthood and the empire. So, and one of the things that gets increasingly emphasized during this time and prior to it is the emperor is, in a sense, meant to stand beyond earthly politics and to participate in God's ruling authority, and that's done primarily through clemency as well as through the administration of justice. So there is a kind of it isn't just a taking of the imperial template and applying it, in a Christian context. The Christian context does destabilize it somewhat. I think the real challenge here So that's where when you did that, you emphasized proceeding from the same principle. So if the priesthood proceeds from the principle of God's saving economy through Jesus Christ, then the emperor has to proceed from the same principle, which is in part why Justinian's rule was benevolent, not just because he was a nice guy.
Yes, it's an excellent point. And I think, well, we'll look at Pope Gelasius's earlier writing on this, because there are going to be different perspectives within the East, there's going to be different perspectives in the West, and certainly I think a lot of bishops are ready to call the emperor to task when he forgets that he too has to be under God's lordship if this is going to hold as a theory. Yes.
And is this sort of what leads directly to the divine right of kings in later times?
Well, it is. And again, I think with the same idea that Father Bill's getting at, the hope there is that you can take the king and you can bring him under God's sovereignty and humble him in the process. It doesn't always work that way. When Charlemagne is crowned Holy Roman Emperor in 800, he takes the crown from the Pope and puts it on his own head. And he says, slow down there. You know, if I'm Holy Roman Emperor, I'm Holy Roman Emperor, right? I mean, Constantine never brought himself under church authority in a way that they never were able to hold him and say, Constantine, look, you two have sinned. Repentance is important. Never, as far as we can tell, right? Constantine said, you know, I got the sign in the sky. It said, conquer by this. That's to me, Constantine. So emperors and kings don't always get this. And, you know, the wielder of the sword often feels, well,
almost, but almost,
another issue.
Yeah, I mean, and you're doing an amazing lecture. This is like TED Talk worthy. But just to say, you know, one of the things, you'll see this not only with divine right of kings, but you also see it in almost every two kingdoms division that persists in the future, which means that the church is its own kingdom and the civil realm its own kingdom, and both are subservient to God. You see that in the Netherlands. There's this whole concept that a influential theologian generated on sphere sovereignty, which means that each sphere of civil society, by that I mean including the government, is ordained by God, and therefore has within it its own kind of logic that it has to do, but it's ultimately subservient to God. My problem at the end of the day with it is that you do tend to lose the prophetic element of Christianity and the alternative, the way in which Christianity is met by its very witness to give parables of grace that confound, and that's where I tend to get. There's always a loss whenever you organize yourself, you know, and that's the loss that seems to go here. Is that fair? I don't want to.
No, I would fully agree with that. And I think, the two-sphere logic is interesting. If we could go to text 2, you can see a version of this provided by Pope Gelasius. I mean, but you know, recognizing the two spheres doesn't always solve the problem either, because then the question becomes, well, which sphere is to prevail if they're in conflict, right? And here you can see the Pope. Now this is the Western counterpart of the Patriarch speaking here, right? But he is writing this to Anastasius, who at the time was the Byzantine emperor, so he chides him here. There are two powers, August Emperor, by which this world is chiefly ruled, namely the sacred authority of the priests and the royal power. Of these, that of the priests is the more weighty, since they have to render an account for even the kings of men in the divine judgment. You are also aware, dear son, that while you are permitted honorably to rule over humankind, yet in things divine, you bow your head humbly before the leaders of the clergy and await from their hands the means of your salvation. In the reception and proper disposition of the heavenly mysteries, you recognize that should you be subordinate rather than superior to the religious order, and that in these matters you depend on their judgment rather than wish to force them to follow your will. If the ministers of religion, recognizing the supremacy granted you from heaven in matters affecting the public order, obey your laws, lest otherwise they might obstruct the course of secular affairs by irrelevant considerations, with what readiness should you not yield them obedience to whom is assigned the dispensing of the sacred mysteries of religion? Accordingly, just as there is no slight danger in the case of the priests if they refrain from speaking when the service of the divinity requires, so there is no little risk for those who disdain, which God forbid, when they should obey. And if it is fitting that the hearts of the faithful should submit to all priests in general who properly administer divine affairs, how much the more is obedience due to the bishop of that see, which the Most High ordained to be above all others. That's the Bishop of Rome. He's reminding him. And which is consequently dutifully honored by the devotion of the whole church. This is a different formulation in the sense that he is sketching out two separate spheres, but he's insisting that the church has to remain the predominant force here. That's a different perspective, and this is going to affect the evolution, really, of church-state understandings in the West and the East and how they will differ. Yes, there was a question, sir.
Well, I'm just curious with Justinian, did he reside in Rome or Constantinople?
No, he was in Constantinople. By the 6th century, Constantinople is where it's at.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Okay. So let's just talk about some of the consequences here, real quick. In terms of what things mean here, going after 200 years or so of imperial Christianity, starting with Constantine, where are we at? Well, certainly affecting the church for centuries forward, we're going to have long-standing conflict and tensions between the Holy Roman Emperor in the West and the Byzantine Emperor in the East. This is, again, going to happen largely after Charlemagne's being crowned Holy Roman Emperor in 800. This formally ends the Dark Ages of Europe, so to speak, which now not all historians are fond of that term, but generally from about the collapse of Rome, the end of the 5th century, to around the rise of Charlemagne. A lot of people consider that really to be the nadir of civilization in the West, and whereas the East was continually growing in power and prestige. But that's going to be a long-term rivalry. The Holy Roman Emperor is going to stake out his claim to reviving the empire in the West, and of course the Byzantines aren't going to take that line down. You're also going to have an equivalent religious rivalry between the Pope in the West and the Patriarch in the East. And this signifies, I think, the difficulties in trying to bring Christianity into unanimity on fundamental questions. And Wilkin talks about this toward the end of the chapter, to quote him here. Justinian's grandest dream, to unite the quarreling ecclesiastical parties into one confession of faith, failed. By the end of the 6th century, on the eve of the rise of Islam, the fissure between Syriac and Coptic-speaking Christians and the imperial church had hardened into separate communions. The unity of the imperial church was destroyed as language, regional loyalties, and theological formulas gave large regions of the Christian world a new sense of identity independent of Constantinople. And we've been talking a lot in this course about how diverse Christian practice and understandings are by the 4th, 5th, 6th century, and Justinian's running up against that. He's dealing with differences of language, region, and culture, which are very, very hard to keep united in a sense of concord. And then, again, the rivalry between the East and the West, with two very, very different understandings of Christian practice, and not just church-state questions, but different cultural embodiments of Christianity, the Latin churches and the Eastern churches. And then you have the question of military conquest, of course. And even though Justinian was certainly celebrated in the 6th century as uniting Rome once again and strengthening the geographic boundaries of the empire, that was very short-lived and really raises a question of what that accomplished long-term, especially once we fast forward to the time of the Crusades, which is just a few centuries down the road in the rise of Islam. Somebody had a question. Yes?
Why was it so short-lived?
Well, because they had a lot of enemies. A lot of enemies. You had the Germanic tribes, and there were vast numbers of them. Were really, really hard for them to control. And the rise of Islam is going to be a formidable military threat as well. I mean, the dream was always there, and you see it revive again under Charlemagne. The hope is that Charlemagne's going to be the one. And time and time again, they're foiled. And that's one of the long-term legacies of imperial Christianity, is trying to figure out how to preserve the geographic boundaries of the empire, which are now to be equated with God's reign as Christendom. So that's going to be an elusive goal, to put it mildly. And then I think just a last question to leave us with is what does this say really about the church's relationship to political power, and if in fact this is a requirement for the church? And there's a very provocative quote I wanted to end with here. This is by John Milbank, who is a great thinker and a very provocative theologian, and who this surprised me a little bit when I saw this. This is a piece that he wrote several years ago called "Power is Necessary for Peace and Defense of Constancy." We're just reading an excerpt of it, but it's quite interesting in what it has to say in connection with what we've been discussing. Charity without power, and ineffective charity, is not really charity at all, but rather an impossible aspiration, because it is ironically doing nothing. Thus, when Pascal called for justice to be combined with power, he was not only calling for the redemption of power, but also for there to be actual justice. Unless we combine charity with practical knowledge, the pursuit of justice, and power, not only does power remain without warrant and knowledge a dangerous scheming, but also charity cannot really emerge from mere formless and impotent aspiration. Of course, the danger is always that the church will be submerged in state power. I think that's partly what you see going on here with the statements of Justinian and the statements of Gelasius, the Pope in the West. And yet remember that the state also gets redeemed, as it were, by the church. This is Father Bill's point from a second ago. So the Justinian Code really did make laws more humane. The codes of warfare really did become more constrained, and state and social welfare really did expand within Byzantium later in the West. And further, without the addition of power to charity, would the church have survived at all? Which is a question that Wilkin is going to raise explicitly. We talked about the rise of Islam here, just around the corner. To refuse this addition is in a way to refuse the resurrection, and the fact that in the end it is Christ's kingly role which is eternal, and not his mediating priestly role. Here I would suggest that perhaps the most uncomfortable historical fact for contemporary Christians is the debt that they owe to kings. Should Charles Martel, in the face of the Muslims, or Alfred of Wessex in the face of the pagans, simply have laid down their swords? Shocking as it may seem, because God creates us as hybrid material spiritual creatures, the church includes certain physical spaces that one may have physically to defend. This defense would be in the name of secular justice rather than some defense of the holy, and yet without the space secured through justice, the offer of the sacred cannot really be made. Now, that's something to grapple with, for sure, but I think one of the ways that we grapple with it is by looking at the history of how this has played out. For me, when I think about this question, I can't but think about what happens during the Crusades, when Christians claim to rescue the Holy Land from the Saracens, as they called them, and what that has done to long-term efforts to create harmony between Christians and Muslims. I think about what happens when anti-Semitic persecutions really did begin in earnest, in a targeted way, in the 5th century and following in the Roman Empire. So I think there's a lot of questions here. Milbank often deals with those questions in a more philosophical vein, but I think we also have to look philosophically, not just philosophically, but historically, and looking at the concrete practices that have evolved as imperial Christianity grew and became much more powerful and more self-aware about what it was trying to accomplish. I would say anyway. I think for Christians now in the 21st century to figure out, well, what does power mean for us, and how do we exercise that power? A very careful historical inquiry, I think, can indicate ways in which that's worked successfully and maybe ways in which it hasn't been as successful. I would offer anyway. Yes, sir.
I would submit that one of the reasons that the Roman Empire in the West fell is because the disparity between the rich and the poor was so vast that the poor didn't have any reason to fight for or lay their lives down for, because the crushing taxes had exterminated the middle class. And so when you see these great disparities, why fight for? What are we fighting for?
Right. Well, it's a good point to raise, but then again, inequality in the empire had been around, for 300-400 years by that point. So that the military situation had changed, I think, by the 5th century. If you look at it that way, I mean, a lot of historians see the influx of the Huns coming in and then disrupting the power balance that had held among a lot of these different German factions that were fighting for control of Northern Europe. And then the long-standing threat of the Persians, which was siphoning off a lot of the military energies of the empire to take care of that issue. But you're right. I mean, there's plenty of things to be concerned about here when you look at how unequal Roman society had become by the 5th century, although that wasn't inherently new. In some ways that goes back to the time of Caesar Augustus, right, who uses the inequality to become the people's champion by throwing food rations to them and public works projects and, portraying himself as the people's champion. So enterprising emperors could always make use of that. You put on some extra games in the Colosseum.
Yeah, but the number,
keep them happy for a while.
the number of people in slavery from the 2nd century to the 5th century had more than doubled.
That's right. Yes. Right. And when I talk about this with my students, I tell them, I say this is one of the things that people worried about when they saw Rome going in the direction of empire rather than remaining a republic, was what was going to happen when you start incorporating all these slaves into society. What's going to happen when people lose sight of their traditional Roman virtues? The wealthy were getting wealthy and wealthy and wealthier. And what's happening to the idea of sacrifice? What's happening to the nobility that used to drive Roman civilization? So it's an excellent point. It certainly plays a role in Rome's collapse. Yes?
So when Rome fell, how did the Western Church survive? The Goths, the Goths were indifferent to Christianity, or?
They often tried to take those Goths or Franks or whichever tribes they could work with and see if they could Christianize them. The example that comes to mind is Clovis or Clodovocar, who was king of the Franks and was basically won over by the church to become a Frankish king who would not only recognize his own tribe but Christianity. And that was kind of, in some ways, where the dream that eventually culminates in Charlemagne comes from, because Charlemagne was a Frank as well. The idea that to the Franks belongs the preservation of Christian civilization. So monks and bishops had to be finding allies, essentially, that could kind of keep the church going and have a power base, very important, to preserve the church. This is often about wealth and power and land. And the church needed those things.
That gets to the heart of that two-sphere problem, right? And so Milbank is saying, got to have some of that power in order to realize the holy kingdom on earth. And so get in there and use it to your benefit.
So if it's with the Goths, if it's with the Franks, if they can be Christianized, if you can take them and civilize them, give them a written law code, give them a culture, something that, basically they decided, none of the German tribes really had, and oftentimes that was true, then all the better, right? Because the gospel will spread, and you've also got power that can support the church's claims, especially in that budding rivalry with the East. Yes, sir.
For any of us who've ever tried to bake bread, it might be worth remembering a little parable Jesus tells about a woman who takes a huge quantity of flour and a very small amount of yeast. And she pounds it, and she pounds it, and she pounds it, until finally that little bit of yeast has completely transformed the entire ball of dough. And it happens silently, and it happens secretly. I'm suggesting that it might be an interesting way to look at this, what Troy is talking about, this Christianization of the world. Our problem, certainly mine, is that I always think the yeast should work faster, and when it doesn't, I start injecting other stuff into the dough, so to speak, rather than letting the yeast do what it's going to do. Do you get my point?
Yes, absolutely.
But we are never content to let it happen.
Well, it's an excellent point. One other thing that I thought I would mention, because I was wrestling with this a bit yesterday and really pondering. We do have other examples of communities that have persisted without needing a secular government to assist them, and I'm thinking of the Jewish diaspora. I mean, really, from the 2nd century onward, Jews had no earthly rulers that they could rely upon to have this role right, in perpetuating their community and sustaining their faith. And no, they weren't growing by the millions. No, they weren't creating empires, but they persisted.
Except after World War II, they strongly decided. or
Well,
prior to
many of them
decided-
did, although not all, right? I mean,
Zionism is the
yeah.
embrace of the second sphere. Right?
Sure. And the Zionist movement was a very, very important one, but it wasn't universally championed by Jews. And if you think even of the Babylonian captivity, right, all the Jews that decided to stay in Mesopotamia rather than going back to Israel, the idea of living as a stranger in a foreign land becoming normative, really, for a lot of Jews, and a fully authentic way of being Jewish. I think one thing that Christendom has tended to do, it's tended to foreclose that option for most Christians. It's just very, very hard to think of not wanting a state that you can get behind and that can further noble goals, though they may be, but to still see that element of power as irreducible. Yes, sir. I know we're running out of time. Oh, thank you. Yeah.
They're not playing bills, so you can't tell.
Thanks, everybody. Yeah, appreciate the discussion, as always. Father Bill, I think, is going to be talking about Islam next week. I think that's the plan, so make sure you come back.